insights to. This webinar series is part of eeInspire, which aims to spark innovation in environmental education, and it is generously supported by our friends and partners at the U.S. Forest Service. And Rachel, if you're here, would you like to say hi to everyone?
Yes, I'm so sorry for joining late. I was going back-to-back meetings, as we all are these days. So this is just such an incredibly important topic. I know I'm going to gain from my own mental health today, hopefully, as well as for the work that we do. And I don't want to take time away from our great speakers. So just so excited to get to be part and listen in on this webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for being here. And thank you to your whole team for all the work you do in conservation education. And I also want to thank all of our affiliate co-hosts. NAAAE has a vast network of over 50 state and provincial affiliates that span all across North America. And our affiliate co-hosts also help us sponsor these webinars, and we are really grateful for all of your support. Thank you also to EPA and EE360 that provide support for our webinar series. And before we move on, just a quick note about using Zoom. Everyone is already on mute to help us cut down on background noise. And to help us with the conversation, I invite all of you to type your questions in the chat and any resources that you want to share with the full group. We'll be sharing a transcript of the chat along with the recording when we're done. So you'll get all of those notes sent straight to your inbox. And for anyone that needs help with the audio, we are doing live captioning right now. So thank you so much to Jenna Lee for your support with the live captioning. And last, thank you to Emily. Thank you to Emily on our staff who's helping us with some of the background support. Thanks for saying hi, and thanks for being here. Emily is the communications and conference specialist from the Natural Start Alliance. Okay, and now we're going to be turning it over to our speakers. And first, we're going to have an introductory exercise from Leslie Davenport. And a little bit about Leslie before Leslie begins. Leslie works as a climate psychologist, educator, consultant, and therapist. And she integrates social science insights into relevant resources for organizations, often exploring the intersectionality of climate, economics, education, and policy and social justice. Leslie helped shape the document Mental Health and Our Changing Climate, Impacts, Implications, and Guidance. And she's also the author of so many books, including Emotional Resiliency in the Era of Climate Change, which is a manual for the mental health field. She's also an advisor to the nonprofits Post Carbon Institute, Climate Mental Health Network, of course, Integrative Healers Action Network, One Resilient Earth, and co-lead of the Climate Psychology Certification at the California Institute of Integral Studies and faculty with their School of the Psychology and Health. So Leslie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to see if I can get one slide up here for us.
Yep.
Okay. This is fill the screen here. There we go. All right. This is just a very brief experiential. You'll be hearing a lot about why it's important to increase our emotional intelligence, bring more of our humanity to the work that we do, to reactivate our creative and intuitive and ancestral and environmental ways of knowing. And we can't do that work or teach these things unless we do the work ourselves. So we're just going to take about a minute here, 2 minutes, and I'm going to invite you to join me to either close your eyes or let them have a soft focus. And let yourself feel or remember or sense the earth below you, even through your shoes and the floor and the foundation. And sensing above you the expansiveness of the sky, deep space, even through the ceiling and through the roof. And then bring attention for just a moment to your breath. And inviting the in-breath to be full, filling up, and the out-breath to be full and emptying out. And just tune into this rhythm. Taking in, releasing out. Let's look at the ways that this rhythm is so much a part of our lives. We see the same ancient rhythm in the waxing and the waning of the moon, in the ebb and flow of the tides, in the turning of the seasons. So just begin to feel and sense this very real, visceral connection to our place in this larger web of life, this network of all living things. So to do a practice like this is not only calming and regulating for the nervous system, which is an important element, but it connects us to this larger understanding. So we'll take just about 3 or 4 more cycles of the breath, feeling into that interconnectedness, that interdependence with all of life. With each other. And to keep that awareness with you while you begin to reorient again to our gathering, the screen in front of you, rather than leaving it behind, go ahead and bring it into our conversation together. And with that, Anne, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thank you for that, Leslie. Whew. So interesting to see the effect that just breathing and pausing can have. So thank you. All right, so now I'm going to be introducing our moderator today, Abhay Singh Satchel. Abhay is a Canadian humanitarian whose work resides at the intersection of climate change, mental health, empathy building, and spirituality. He's the founder of Break the Divide, a nonprofit organization based on the principles of environmentalism, sustainability, and reconciliation that focuses on fostering empathy and understanding to inspire local action projects. As a result of his work, Abhay has been recognized as one of Canada's top 25 under 25 environmentalists and is featured as one of 10 international youth change makers in Canada. That's awesome. Outside of his activism, Abhay is a student at the University of Toronto, studying global health and peace and conflict studies, and is also a public speaker on environmental and climate issues. Abhay is a Climate Mental Health Network Gen Z advisor. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Abhay. Thank you so much for your help kicking it off.
Yeah, thank you, Anne, and thank you everyone for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here to chat about this very important topic. All of us on this stage today and everyone attending understands the necessity of climate action. And as we engage in climate education, I think it's so critical that we talk about the emotional piece behind it. I'm so excited to be able to talk to all our panelists today about exactly that. I'd like to begin with a quick personal story about how I really got connected to this issue. And when I was 14 years old, I remember being extremely overwhelmed by climate change and the emotions of it. And this was when I, as a 14-year-old young Canadian, had the opportunity to travel to the Canadian and Greenlandic Arctic. And at 14 years old, there was this one moment at the elicit ice fjord that I remember. So this is a place where ice is stretched out for miles and miles, as far away as your eye can see. And all 200 of us on this expedition to the Arctic, all of us went silent for a moment, and we could literally hear icebergs melting. And so at 14 years old, I felt on top of the world, but like the burden of the world was on my shoulders. And I felt excited by the prospect of climate action, but I felt worried about the future. I was anxious. I felt guilty about me being in the Arctic. I felt concerned. I really didn't know how to feel. And that's how I started, by getting engaged in climate mental health, looking at these intersections between how we engage with the environment, how we engage with ourselves and the people around us. I think that's a critical piece of taking action on climate change itself. And so I'm really excited for this conversation today. Throughout the conversation, if you do have any questions, please do message in the chat. I think there's a Q&A box for everyone there. And so without further ado, I'd love to introduce our first panelist, Larissa Dooley. So Dr. Larissa Dooley is a psychologist and research scientist at the Sea Change Institute. With a background in health psychology, she conducts research and helps design programs aimed at combating climate change, as well as its impacts on mental health. Dr. Dooley recently co-authored a report on climate anxiety in young people, a particular interest of my own. And Dr. Dooley, in doing so, did this in partnership with the Blue Shield of California. She's also a research advisor for the Climate Mental Health Network. And Dr. Dooley is the parent organizer of Future Fighters, a child-led environmental group founded by her elementary school-aged daughter. Dr. Dooley, Larissa, it's wonderful to have you here. And I'd love if you could just begin by talking about what are the impacts of climate change on the mental health of young people? And in educational settings, what can we do about that?
Thank you, Abe. Yeah, so I just wanted to make sure I was unmuted. Okay, great. So yeah, let's talk first about identifying the problem. So what climate change is negatively impacting the mental health and well-being of young people. And how is this happening? Well, first, a rapidly increasing percentage of young people have lived through a climate change related disaster, a wildfire, a flood, a storm. This can be highly traumatic. It can also lead to major losses, the loss of a loved one, a pet, a home, all of which can cause significant stress and mental health issues. Additionally, even young people who haven't been directly impacted by a climate disaster yet can experience significant psychological pain over the reality of climate change. Just knowing that climate change is happening, that it's causing suffering and loss all over the world, can take a really serious psychological toll. Learning about environmental problems in the classroom, watching climate disasters play out in the news, or witnessing negative changes in one's environment, like these kids on the beach after an oil spill, all of this can cause grief and turmoil. So I want to show you a brief clip that can be a little bit emotional to watch. But I can sit here and talk about this stuff as an academic, but I think it's really more powerful to sort of hear directly from a young person as a kind of reminder of what we're really talking about here and what's at stake. The clip I'm going to show you is from a video of a 6-year-old boy in the car with his mother and his siblings after he watched a documentary in school about environmental problems.
People are just being rude to it. They throw trash on the ground. They cut down trees. They make forests into places, into roads. And they need to think about what they are doing and what they are doing to the planet, what they are doing to animals. They are being so bad.
So if that video was emotional for you to watch, you're not alone. I've watched it several times and it never gets easier. It's really upsetting what's going on in the world at large and how it's affecting our young people, our students, our kids. And I think also if we're feeling upset after watching that, we do well to remember that when we feel upset about something, it's really a signal or a sign that something's wrong and something needs to change. Research suggests that young people, including children, adolescents, and even young adults, are particularly vulnerable to the mental health impacts of climate change. And this is really for a few different reasons. First, their nervous systems are still developing, rendering them more vulnerable to the effects of intense stress, like the stress of climate change. For example, adolescence is a key period we know for the emergence of psychopathology. Additionally, young people often don't have The emotion regulation capacities, they're still developing them, and the resilience resources that they need yet to effectively cope with the intense stresses of climate change. And also, finally, we know that really, climate projections predict that young people are poised to bear the brunt of climate change. So really, there's a reason for them to be particularly worried. So I talked about how young people are particularly vulnerable to the mental health impacts of climate change, and a group that's sort of doubly at risk for climate mental health impacts are young people of color. Due to structural racism, people of color and low-income communities are exposed to significantly more pollution and environmental disasters compared with wider and more affluent communities. This greater exposure, compounded with pre-existing stressors like poverty and racism and racial violence, can lead to significantly higher risks for mental health impacts. There's a growing body of research that shows that young people are being profoundly impacted by the psychological toll of climate change. There was a recent global study of 10,000 young people across 10 countries, and they found really sobering results. 75%, this is just a brief snapshot, 75% of the young people said the future is frightening. 56% said humanity is doomed. 55% said that the things I value most will be destroyed. So this is really bad news, right? But what can we do about it? What strategies do we have for building emotional resilience and well-being? Well, first, we should identify our goals. What should our goals be as educators for helping support our students' mental health in the face of climate change? Well, first, I think it's important to acknowledge that the goal should not be to eradicate negative emotions about climate change. It would be weird to not feel bad about this grave threat to the planet and the survival of humanity. But the goal instead then is to not be debilitated or paralyzed by our feelings. And this brings us to the idea of emotional resilience, which is really can be defined as the ability to tolerate negative feelings without sort of being taken down by them, or even the ability to experience positive emotions and a sense of well-being, even in the midst of significant difficulty. So our team, we did this big report. We did an in-depth literature review. We consulted with a lot of experts in this area, including Leslie Davenport, who we heard from and who's going to talk after me again. And based on this really in-depth look into this literature, we developed this sort of framework of 7 core strategies that we believe are fundamental for coping with climate emotions. And these are strategies that we can use to support our students in the classroom or outside if you're sort of an informal educator. But there are also strategies that we should use as educators to first deal with our own emotions about climate change, because we really need to first deal with our own emotions before we can effectively support others. So I'm just going to touch on each of these strategies really briefly for the sake of time, and then my fellow panelists are going to go into some of them in more detail. So the first of these core components is acknowledging and validating feelings. When you're teaching about climate change or environmental problems, this can involve really building time into the lesson plan to acknowledge and discuss emotions that may have been elicited by the information that you shared, and providing a safe and supportive space for the expression of emotions. This involves really normalizing feelings for young people and pointing out that these emotions are really a natural response to a frightening situation. And this can also involve a teacher sort of sharing their own emotions. And doing that, sharing a teacher's own emotions, to sort of engage reciprocity in that way, can kind of overcome the power differentials that sometimes stop students from, that can be kind of a roadblock to students sharing or being forthright about their emotions. So saying, I know this reading might have been kind of depressing or difficult for many. I sometimes feel negative emotions about that too, and this is how I deal with them, and kind of also asking the students what they might be feeling. And I just want to emphasize that this piece in and of itself is really important, because that global study that I referred to earlier, for example, found that a huge amount, I think it was 40% of young people, said that when they try to talk to other people, especially in the grown-ups in their lives, about climate change and their feelings about climate change, their concerns are often ignored, brushed off, and belittled. So it's really important that we kind of take the time to ask students and young people about how they're feeling and hold space for those emotions. The second strategy involves providing tools and practices for helping students to process those emotions. And there are a number of different emotion coping tools that can be effective for climate emotions: mindfulness, gratitude, reframing. I'm going to let Leslie Davenport, who's speaking next, go into more detail on some of those, and some other panelists might as well. Social connection. So there's a wealth of research showing that connecting and feeling supported and cared for by others has benefits for mental health and is a major source of resilience. So helping students feel supported and seen by you and the other students and creating a sense of sort of community in the classroom can really go a long way. Connecting with nature. So there's a wealth of research that suggests that spending time in nature can calm the nervous system, lower stress, and reduce rumination, which are sort of repetitive negative thoughts, which we often see with people high in climate anxiety. So helping bring students into nature, you can have class outside, working in the garden, or encouraging students to take study breaks on their own in nature can be beneficial. I should mention a caveat here, which is that for many Black Americans, the idea of connecting with nature can sometimes be fraught with complexity because that violence towards Black Americans has often historically occurred in wilderness spaces. So that can be sort of suggesting that Black Americans connect with nature as a means of helping with climate emotions can be marred with complexity. So that's just something to sort of be aware of. Taking climate action. This is probably the most powerful and efficient strategy for combating climate anxiety, but it should notably be done sort of after you've taken time to acknowledge and process emotions. But climate action is really powerful because it really gets at kind of the fundamental issue of climate anxiety, which climate anxiety sort of at its core often involves feelings of uncontrollability and helplessness. And activism can really, taking action for climate change or against climate change can really combat those feelings by helping individuals instead gain a sense of agency and empowerment. So this can involve encouraging your students to take action, helping them identify ways to take action and supporting their efforts, and then modeling climate action by engaging in it yourself or even side by side with your students. Self-care. So this is a really important one. Encourage your students to take breaks, to slow down, to be present, to do things that really bring them joy. And this is an important one because students are often under tremendous pressure to achieve and to meet certain goals. And so I think really modeling, taking breaks, building breaks into lesson plans and explicitly encouraging breaks for self-care is really important. And the final one is climate justice awareness. So this involves helping your students cultivate an awareness of climate justice and how climate change disproportionately affects certain communities, educating them about that. And for students who identify as BIPOC, this might involve helping them recognize how their climate emotions may be exacerbated by other overlapping chronic stressors. And for students who don't identify with these groups, it might involve helping these students understand these issues, identify their personal stance on them, and resolve to be part of a just solution. Okay, so thank you. I know that was a lot, but the panelists, I'm going to pass the baton to Leslie, and some of the other panelists are going to talk about some of those pieces in a lot more depth.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Larissa. I really do think when we're talking about these emotions, especially with young people, there are so many emotions that underpin the ones that come to the surface. We can see things like betrayal and helplessness and hopelessness underpinning a lot of these emotions. But with your talk about emotional resilience, it really does seem like it's more than just taking action. Is what young people often hear, that we are the future and that by taking climate action we can feel a lot better. But it really goes to show that there is a lot more at play. And so Anne has already introduced Leslie Davenport, a climate psychologist, educator, consultant, author in this field. Leslie, I'd love to hear your thoughts on approaches to building resilience and flourishing. How can we as individuals, as educators, but also with our youth, work to create and build capacity for these coping tools, especially in terms of self-care?
Thank you. Yes, let me answer some of those questions with a few slides as well. I'm going to go through this information really quickly, but if there's things people want to hear more about, take note and we can swing back around in the questions and answers. So this has been already addressed a little bit, but it's really important not to pathologize these feelings, that in fact, if kids, we as adults are paying attention and care, we are going to be experiencing big feelings. That is the natural human response. And frankly, we'd have more of a problem if that weren't the case. That being said, there's a lot that can be done to help address them skillfully, to learn about emotional regulation so that it doesn't become overwhelming. So the essence, and again, Larissa spoke to this too, is that we need to blend. And I love that this seminar is like talking about bringing these both together, both what we feel and what we do as a more united effort. It's really been polarized in the past, and it's lovely to see this coming together. When it comes to feelings, honestly, as a society, we still get a lot of this backwards. And I hear this still a fair amount for youth working in social justice areas, environmental nonprofits, that one, this is such an urgent issue that we can't take time for self-care. There's too much to do and it needs to be done now. And maybe if I did allow time for my sadness, my anger, I might just fall into a pit of despair and become ineffective. And what's more true when we look at neuroscience and we understand how this works, it's that when we try and ignore feelings, pretend they're not there, push them underground, exile them, that's when we have problems, because those feelings are going to come up anyway, but they're going to come up in a less skillful way. And we really end up going at war with ourselves. We try and cut off these very natural parts of our humanity. So it's really great to start with the basics, to not only acknowledge them, but understand them as messengers. That if we're feeling sadness, it's because there's a message that something is terribly wrong. Maybe there's something that needs to be let go of to make room for something new. When anger rises up, it's often because there's a boundary that's been crossed, there's been injustices that have occurred, and it helps us speak up and take a stand for what we believe and know to be true. And fear is, again, based on our evolutionary psychology, tuning us into threat and harm and how to respond to that. And there are many ways to do this, and some of it is just simple. Questions like this that can become part of a discussion. Some of the things I love most about the natural world, but I feel the saddest when I hear, and I get really angry when I think about, and I get scared when I learn that. And what I'm most excited about getting involved in is, and these can all go into very rich discussions. We do need to understand this a little bit from a trauma-informed perspective, and this is a very key concept, what's just called our window of tolerance or our zone of resilience. And it means that we know how to get things done, navigate our social relationships, meet our responsibilities, but if the stresses are too big or there's too many of them and we move outside of that realm, we either lash out and get angry and knee-jerk reaction, or we withdraw and isolate and numb out. And especially for teens, that feeling of just wanting not to hear or see anything more can lead to substance use, substance abuse as well, just many forms of numbing out. So a lot of emotional resilience work is learning where those edges are for each person and learning to stretch that zone of resilience, because that is not a fixed state. It can stretch and it can expand. So a way to structure this, and it relates to what Larissa was talking about, is called toggling. So in the classroom, we're teaching about climate, but then it's taking time to step back and acknowledge what feelings are coming up in response. And then perhaps a mindfulness tool or conversations or artwork or planning to help be involved in action steps to address some of this is a really important thing. Because again, even as adults, we don't have this. We get a lot of information, bad news, difficult news, without those support systems in place to deal with the emotional side of all of this. So this is just one example of many, many kinds of tools, but like we shared together, it's amazing how quickly the breath can be a reset for the nervous system. Really easy to do with kids. And there's really fun ways. This is one where you stand up and shake from head to toe, sort of like a dog. And it usually gets people laughing, but there's also a science behind why it's a reset for the nervous system, actually based on what animals do in the wild when they experience trauma. Super quickly, the approach to climate education varies a lot by age and developmental stages. So the really young kids, just support them in that natural love and delight of nature, how seasons work and how plants grow and what rainbows are. And by allowing them to fall in love with that, the way they're naturally prone to doing, helps support the likelihood of them becoming stewards, because we want to protect and care for those things that we love. As kids get older, there's more of a tie with roles that they can take, and there can be school initiatives, all kinds of things, a Meatless Monday, a Turn It Off campaign regarding energy usage, where they can have a more direct experience of cause and effect about what our actions are and what the outcome is. And I would say at around age 10, depending on the kids and up, is when a lot of those hard feelings begin to consistently come into play, where just from the idea of it really lands more seriously with kids and the need to have some support systems. By this age, well, certainly all along, open discussions and all of these categories encourage ways for healthy expression of feelings, but it's really useful to help them find accurate resources at this point where they're doing their own looking and their own research. And then finally, the older kids get them where they can take the lead and helping to provide platforms without necessarily putting the brunt of the responsibility on their shoulders. And that activism can look like many, many things. Civic action is certainly essential. We're talking about everything occurring within the context of social justice and a community focus, but it can also be based on what kids are naturally drawn to. If you have a little one who wants to be a chef, it can so easily move into where does the food come from and what do we need to understand about soil and sustainability and agricultural models and all kinds of and equity issues. So to use their own talents and where they're drawn to, someone who's artistic can use their outlets for messaging related to sustainability. And this is certainly, we're all in this together. That as Larissa said, it's okay as educators to say, we're learning too, we're feeling about this too, and let's talk about it and let's work together on this. Okay, we'll come back to resources later. So I'm going to stop my share and pass this along.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Leslie. I absolutely do think that, as you've mentioned, building emotional resilience in an era of climate change. I know someone mentioned in the chat that they're a huge fan of your book. It's critical to reflect on these emotions. And from what you described, it really does sound like these strategies that we build at an individual and collective level, while self-care and reflection is critical, these are actually the tools that we can build in within education as prerequisites so that when people are engaging within climate action, it's psychologically safe and it keeps people engaged past the point of burnout. And so I'm very curious as we continue our discussion here, how we build this in at a programmatic level. And our next panelist, Andra, is going to discuss exactly that. So Andrea Goyen is the Environmental Literacy and Sustainability Coordinator at the San Mateo County Office of Education. She provides leadership in implementing a broad environmental literacy and sustainability initiative that focuses on promoting environmental literacy and preparing leaders to integrate environmental sustainability and a climate-ready mindset across the school community's campus, curriculum, community, and culture. 4 C's, I love it. Andra served in a variety of roles in education across public and private and national and international schools. She holds a BA in International Relations and a teaching credential from UC Davis and an MBA in Sustainable Systems from Presidio Graduate School. So Andra, it would be wonderful if you could speak to the San Mateo County programs. What are they and why were they created?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me here. This has been really interesting. I see so many parallels and crossovers already to our work. So I'm going to share my screen so that people have some visuals. But what I can share is a little bit about how our regional initiative is supporting addressing climate emotions in education. And I did put the link to this in the chat because I have some resources that are embedded. But just like as a really quick frame of where I'm coming from. So I'm working in the California context of education. In California, we have 11 regions that are broken into 58 county offices of education, and we support 1,000 school districts. So I work in the San Mateo County Office of Ed, and we support 23 school districts. And we, like was shared a minute ago, we do have a broad initiative providing all this support for environmental literacy and environmental sustainability and climate resilience. And so I found early on that because we're bringing this, and I should have said this, we're the first county office in the state to launch an initiative like this. I found early on that we really needed to figure out ways to frame everything that we're talking about with the environment and climate change with some trauma-informed practices, because it was very overwhelming for people who had not really seen the data and didn't really understand the seriousness of the crisis. So we've linked everything that we do in our initiative to this idea of doing this work across a whole school, so that there's entry points everywhere, like in facilities, in curriculum, and community and culture. And in our broader initiative that we run, we have a lot of different capacity building programs. We have networks, and we also do a lot of customized technical assistance and some awards programs. But really the key thing that we've done is to really put together a lot of resources that go along with all these different programs. So I can share that, like, as a starting point, when we run our program, so whether or not it's like a customized technical assistance for a district regarding environmental literacy and climate change, or even in our own programs, we really start with this idea of building the case for how environmental injustice and climate crisis are connected to trauma and emotions. And that was really shared well by both Larissa and Leslie, I think. So I'm not going to go too far into it, but I will say that it's really important. We found it's really important to make sure everyone has that shared understanding of what trauma is, how it's connected to adverse childhood experiences. And we go pretty quickly into showing that there are adverse childhood experiences that individuals experience, and then there's adverse community environments, right? So we do a lot of like connecting some already existing knowledge that people have about trauma to broadening their lens, that as what Larissa and Leslie were both sharing about. And then we also add in this like third layer and sharing that, you know, climate impacts add an additional layer of acute trauma. And then from all of that, we have really, at that point, built this case for our teachers and our educators that all of this is related to trauma. And it happens to be in our county office. I'm so grateful that we have a really amazing student services team who had already begun to bring this trauma-informed practices framework to our school district. So around 2017, when we launched this initiative, they were bringing this in as well. So I was able to take our county-wide framework that we were using and say, okay, how could we see this framework through the lens of environment and climate, and really pair that well with all the different professional development our schools were already getting around trauma-informed practices, and just really show that alignment. So a lot of what we do in our work is to say like, this is not in addition, this is not adding on more stuff. This is just about aligning what you're already doing to have an environmental and climate lens. And I think that's really helped folks, especially who already have robust social and emotional stuff or who are starting that process as well. So what this alignment has looked like is to really show where the connections are across this whole school's framework. So for example, I'm just going to show a couple of them from that framework. One is safety and predictability. So we recognize that when it comes to climate change, it is complex and it's volatile and it's uncertain in some ways, but there's also a fair amount of predictability to seasons, and that if things are going to increase, they're going to increase during those seasons for the most part. We don't know exactly how bad it will be, but we know kind of like a general sense of when some of those issues are going to happen. So we talk about, well, if that's the case, then what changes do school decision makers need to make in their planning and operations in order to become safe and predictable around the idea of climate change? So we offer up suggestions in the community and culture. So having like an environmental or climate crisis working group. We offer up suggestions for what they can do in curriculum and instruction. So make that really flexible to be something that you might need to shut down in your curriculum and actually switch gears and talk about these climate issues that are happening. And then we talk about looking at the data and really making sure that you've got a plan in place for mitigation. And then we offer up like really positive solutions, like have a living schoolyard. That's a great resilient strategy. That's also really great for time in nature. Another thing is just understanding, just helping our school districts understand, again, that deep connection to trauma and stress, and recognizing that when we have high heat days or when we have floods and other things, or when we hear a lot about it on the news, people are coming to school with heightened emotions, and to really be mindful of that. And then to do some positive things, like giving people a chance to not just live in the like nature's always scary and awful, but to be like nature's also incredible and we rely on it to survive. So giving people a chance to do things like celebrate Earth Day and have mindfulness moments. So we spend a lot of time kind of like helping our school districts and people think about what could you really do to put a system in place to make sure that you're really addressing this thoughtfully across everything. And then one more, even though there's 6, I'm just going to share one more. Just this idea of really empowering change and really empowering leadership. And so we do this we suggest doing this with all different stakeholders in school communities, but in particular, of course, with students. So giving students opportunities to bring forward solutionary ideas, to solve those problems that are on their campuses or in their community, and to not say no. We always say, just say yes to students when they bring solutions like reusable utensils and waste sorting practices. Like figure out a way to say yes so that they are empowered and not feeling what's so hopeless and left in despair. So those are some of the ways that we, some suggestions that we have, and those links are also in the slide deck. And then I can just share, because we run, so that's like what we do when we do professional development in one of our school districts. And then when we run our own capacity building programs for teachers and for students and for administrators, we build in a lot of the activities that were shared there directly into those programs. So for example, we always, whenever we introduce climate change and the intense, like we go through all the data and we have some simulation activities, we always close that with the climate ribbon. And we always, the climate ribbon really asks people to think about like, what do you love and hope and never lose to climate chaos? And we do that with all different age groups, and we always get the same response. People are like, thank you so much. You just took us through some really intense data, but thank you for like honoring the fact that we're heightened in our emotions and we need a moment to process collectively. So if you're going to do some PD, I recommend doing something like that. We also make sure to embed trauma-informed nature connection activities into our professional development. So we really try to help people build a practice and a lens for spending time in nature or doing things with nature. Even like one of our activities, because we did a lot of this during like distance work and distance learning time, was just like, find a house plant, find a house pet, find a leaf, find anything, like sit with it, commune with it, right? So that people knew that they could do this, in their own homes as well. We spend some time talking about how to bring like literature into the work, and really showing the use of children's books or youth books or adult books, and how you can use these as tools for learning, and how you can harness like the power of stories for people to really glom onto. And we especially when we're working with folks like teachers who are working with some of our youngest learners as well. And then one other thing is, I would just say that we do a lot to support community impact projects. So most of our programs are knowledge to action. So we take them through that knowledge of the environmental and climate crisis, but then we also empower them to actually lead a community impact project that will make a difference. So we've put together, and these resources are in the notes of the slide deck, but we've put together a lot of different resource guides for how to, if you're doing a student-led community impact project, how to do it, and project examples. And for administrators, the same thing. Like if you're a principal or a district employee, like here's how you lead a community impact project. We also do a lot of coaching and technical support for that. And then one thing I can share is that we try to keep things like really positive. So we have a little change maker story webpage where we are able to share out those stories of change. And we've found that that has been such a useful tool for keeping people going and keeping people excited about this. And then we host an annual awards program as well. So I think that that can really help people feel like proud of what they did and really engaged with it. So those are some of the ways. And then I would be remiss if I didn't share this as well. When we work with teachers, we help them understand that there's any entry point is okay when it comes to bringing environmental literacy and climate literacy into your classroom, and that they really want to make sure when they do that they're doing that in a trauma-informed way. And then we really help them to get themselves all the way to leading their own knowledge to action solutionary PBL units with their students so that their students can do that empowering work. So all of our unit exemplars can be found on our fellowship page if people are interested in doing something similar. But I think there's a lot that can be done. And I'd say for most teachers, when they come to our program, they say something like, I've always either I've never taught about this and I now know I have to, or I have been teaching about climate change and environmental issues for years and I never once thought to talk about the emotions of it. And so that we really hit that with our teachers. Like that's the most important thing, is that you're really giving kids a chance to do that. So that's it for me, and excited to take questions later.
Yeah, this is incredibly exciting, I think, for all of us here, whether we're educators or young people or anywhere in between. Being connected with the Climate Mental Health Network, Sea Change Institute, NAAA, we do now have these access to resources that can help us in teaching. But Andre, one of the things I really appreciate about the work that you're doing is you're helping people create community. And I think your programming is the perfect example of focusing on social connectedness and allowing young people to exist in environments where they experience hope and experience the education that is so necessary as that prerequisite for climate action. I know that in my nonprofit, Break the Divide, we follow an empathy to action approach that helps youth go from a state of apathy or disconnectedness to action through a lot of what you talked about. And I think connecting to community is a really critical piece of what you talked about there. Leslie talked about integrating passions. Andre, you're talking about connecting to community. And as we speak about community and youth connections, our last panel is here for today. And I know we're running a bit short on time, so we're hoping to push the question session back a bit later on if folks are able to say. The session is recorded and everyone will be getting a link as well. But without further ado, our last panelist for today is McKenna Dunbar, who's on a mission to transform the energy industry in the global shift to a net zero carbon economy. So McKenna is an innovator and clean energy professional recognized as a prominent voice advocating for a future rooted in equity and environmental justice. We've been talking a bit about justice so far. And at the Sierra Club, McKenna acts as the building electrification lead for the Virginia chapter and is also the founder and president of the Ecological Initiative, a youth-based environmental advocacy nonprofit, and the CEO of Meccano, a social enterprise organization centered at the nexus of community, which we've been talking about, equity and engagement in the ESG and CSR spheres. McKenna is also a member of the Climate Mental Health Network's Gen Z Advisory Board. McKenna and I are on that same network. We go way back. And McKenna is a rising senior at the University of Richmond, attaining a BS in Business Administration and a BA in Environmental Studies. McKenna is busy. And McKenna, I'd love you to talk a bit about the process of environmental education as an individual, the sorts of work that you're doing, and how we engage in the sorts of work that fosters environmental justice and make sure that equity and that diversity piece is critical in the work that we're doing.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I just want to first start off by saying in order to shift and positively develop youth perspectives on climate change, we must integrate the foundations of environmental justice in conversations and environmental education programming. And this process encourages empathy and diversity for the future of our nation and the shift to a more sustainable and equitable world. I view environmental justice as a sphere that contains three main frameworks, and these frameworks of justice include a representative aspect, a procedural one, and a distributive element. Representative justice and environmental justice refers to the manner of how marginalized communities are impacted by harmful developments or environmental degradation activities, and how these individuals are represented in decision-making processes in order to correct these inequities. Procedural justice expands on the need for decision-making processes to be accessible, fair, and sustainable for marginalized communities and impacted populations to participate in. And then in my perspective, distributive justice in particular grounds itself on the foundations of equity, making sure that no one in an impacted community bears a disproportionate burden of environmental stressors or benefits of the population. And while the meaning of equity really may be considered an overused trope to some, the notion of everyone receiving the support that they need in the face of environmental inequities holds true for my ethical framework. Mental health support for youth is directly tied to issues of environmental justice and support as it relates to increasing environmental stewardship in schools, lifting up voices of the marginalized and underserved, and ensuring that the key voices of our nation are not being left out of developmental procedures. And this also comes in the form of advancing the next leaders of this socio-cultural shift to a more sustainable and efficient practices as we mitigate the biggest change and the biggest challenge our world has faced to date. Fundamentally, justice refers to practices and behaviors being right or wrong. There are gray areas, and in terms of environmental justice, in my perspective, it really refers to how humanity treats the environment as a collective and behaving in a way as a collective humanity that preserves the environment as it best suits humans physically, biologically, but more importantly, emotionally, in terms of keeping ecosystems healthy enough to where they really sustain the ecosystems that we rely on. It means that humanity preserves the global systems as we need it to exist for all of these different variables, and especially the psychological and cultural elements. Youth are at the apex of this phenomena and should really be a key focus as we mobilize as agents for change. The ideology that justice in America really comes from a more rigid philosophical perspective. And justice was really first defined from that perspective in 300 BC by Socrates and through Plato's perspective of defining justice. America, from a Western perspective, has really been reeling with justice for its entire existence. And it has culminated into ideals of individual freedoms as opposed to freedoms that protect the environment. It's really just about the freedom of the individual, and climate change restricts these freedoms and causes feelings of anxiety, sadness, and grief in the youth population. Climate anxiety, also known as eco-anxiety, is inextricably tied to these ideals of freedom and the convergence of our own security in the modern world. Youth ask themselves, how can I make sustainable changes in my own school and work life when the world is crumbling all around me? Why do educators and professionals seem to ignore the impending environmental disasters that is taking place in the communities and environments surrounding me? How will we lead into a future of so many unknowns and uncertainties? It is fundamentally the role of educators and older allies to act as mentors to promote youth development and mental health resources so that there are more holistic understandings of mitigating climate anxiety in the youth population. And that is why I founded my nonprofit organization, Ecological Justice Initiative, back in the fall of 2020 when I was just 19 years old. Founding my nonprofit has been central to my development as a leader for collaborating in the environmental justice sphere and my own emergence as a student in the climate change mitigation sphere. I started EJI to fill a need that was not being met in the various environmental communities that I was a part of. And This need was offering meaningful opportunities for youth, especially undergraduate students, to engage in environmental justice work. And throughout my environmental advocacy time, I noticed that I was the only young person in the room. It was virtual, as this is now, but in the virtual setting. And I worked so closely with seasoned professionals who have been supporting sustainability initiatives for decades. And as an undergraduate freshman with very little experience in engaging in such initiatives, it was quite intimidating to collaborate with others who live and breathe environmental justice. So I initiated an organization to focus on integrating and extending resources, youth initiatives and internship opportunities to younger environmentalists and students like myself. And fundamentally, the goal of EJI was to create an opportunity pipeline of sorts. And since its founding, fellows have presented research at climate summits, secured environmental related internships, attended in-depth writing training sessions on grassroots organizing, networked with climate change professionals, and have gone off to produce films and educational related programming that highlights their passions and how they sustainably have improved their communities at large. For example, one of the fellows here in the picture, Megan Mabey, a University of Richmond geography and visual media arts practice major, and a former artist in residence at EGI, has just finished producing a short film on environmental degradation and the impact of Virginia's first mega landfill in the rural community of Charles City County. This project she has carried out not only highlights the need for investing in the well-being of underserved communities, both with physical infrastructure and mental health services and green workforce development, but also allows her to express her own passions as it relates to the convergence of climate change and videography, which one of the former panelists spoke about. It's really about using your own skills as a youth and as an organizer to promote climate change mitigation in a sustainable and equitable way. Another University of Richmond student, India Woodfolk, an environmental studies and anthropology senior, she and I won a grant last spring that allowed us to host a summer program called Renewable Energy Education and Sustainable Development for underserved students in Richmond. And this really centered on coalition building, equitable mental health resources and meditation, as well as environmental advocacy to equip students with the tools and resources to be agents of change in their community. And without the support of countless mentors, particularly Dr. Mary Finley Brooke, I would not be where I am today. I'm only 21, but I would not have been immersed in environmental justice initiatives the way that I am now without the support of educators and leaders in the education sphere, like many of you here that are attending this webinar. I would not have been able to gain as much experience and learn more about the dynamic nature of climate change in my own local and national communities that I'm a part of. And without individuals like Sarah Newman, founder of the Climate Mental Health Network, I would not have been able to connect with an international community of allies and advocates of mental health who are trying to change the conversation. Like that little boy in the video that Larissa showed us said, they need to think about what they are doing to the planet. My goal throughout my career is to mitigate climate change through developing equitable energy systems, hosting youth-focused environmental education programs, and highlighting the impact that marginalized and underserved communities face as a result of systemic social determinants. And today, I would like to just end on one message. As many of us scroll through our social media feeds and interact with environmental communities online, we are met with many posts that say very similar things about how climate justice is a priority, mitigating eco-anxiety and shifting into a renewable energy future is a priority. I think it is imperative to think about the ways that we access our information surrounding the environmental and energy sphere and mental health sphere, and actively brainstorm the ways to expand diverse perspectives and how we interact with the digital world. And this comes in the form of having educators and professionals really honing in on the foundation of environmental justice and the benefits of concentrating on mental health as we go into a future of unknowns and uncertainties. So please ask yourself, how many of your posts are from members of the LGBT community? How many are from youth voices? How many are from BIPOC founded organizations or individuals? As we veer into the net zero carbon economy, we must prioritize marginalized and youth voices, because without diversity in both background and thought, how are we supposed to fundamentally change the social and economic structures and the educational structures of the modern world without the perspectives of a key part of this transition? Just some food for thought. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, McKenna. That is powerful. And I think, oops. Okay, it looks like we're all good here. No, that is absolutely powerful. And it really just reminded me of the importance of these voices in what we're doing here. I think bringing these coalition of voices together is how we create that action. And one thing you really touched on there is the importance of diverse knowledge systems, knowledge paradigms. And I think all of us in the work that we do should think of ways that we can engage with local indigenous knowledge, engage with different ways of knowing that we can integrate into our voices, into our education itself. And that second piece there that you brought up, McKenna, I really do think that when we're thinking about young people, we need to recognize that, again, there are so many emotions that underpin the responses that we see. And so if someone doesn't engage in climate action and someone experiences sort of a soft denial or an outright denial of the existence of climate change, that often might be just a response to the betrayal, the helplessness, the hopelessness that people are experiencing. And as leaders in this space, everyone in this panel and everyone attending today, as leaders and educators, at an individual level, we need to act in accordance with our values and lead the change that is necessary. So I know that we are right past the hour. For those that do need to get going, we appreciate everyone being here, but we are going to continue on for another 5 to 10 minutes. And we see that in the chat right now. So without further ado, I'd like to begin a quick Q&A with our key panelists here today. Hopefully we can get everyone to this, again, shared stage. I'd love to start with McKenna, actually. A question a bit about your interest for this field into the future. A lot of people in the chat have been asking about the biggest ways to empower young people. You talked about the importance of uplifting these voices, and throughout the chat, we've mentioned a few resources that we can use. What are some of the ways that we can empower young people, and what areas in this work are you specifically excited for, McKenna?
I believe that one of the fundamental ways that we can encourage young people as we transition to a future where all industries, transportation sector, art, business, and culture are sustainably focused and are focused on climate change mitigation is really about relationship building and encouraging community engagement and forming positive and fulfilling relationships with other youth and support systems. As I mentioned, educators are a key part of this transition in forming safe spaces and forming coalitions and really highlighting the types of resources that are available for youth to be a part of. And that can start with a form of joining your school's environmental club. At Sierra Club, I work directly with a high school student that goes to an all-girls high school that wanted to learn more about the ways to mitigate climate change, specifically through integrating solar on schools, which is a key priority of the department that I lead. But she first wanted to join her school's environmental club, and that's how she started to form her own community that really surrounded climate change mitigation, and just being able to have honest and vulnerable conversations with peers that bring to the table perspectives of hope, but also of sadness and how they feel as young people who are facing so many things in the world, in a global pandemic, just injustices that are occurring across the pond, and really being able to have a safe space to convene and to be able to form healthy relationships with people your own age. The fundamental message of what I'm just saying is you're not alone. Young people are not alone in their feelings, and it's important that each and every youth knows that, because when you become isolated and when you think that you're the only one feeling a certain emotion, that is when being overwhelmed really is highlighted. And forming community and relationship building is really a way to mitigate that. And not only does that form coalition, it forms hope, and hope is the key to the transition to a better world.
That's beautiful. Relationships are connected to community, and community creates hope. And hope is an active process. Hope is a verb, and it's something that we must consistently engage in. One of the things you brought up, McKenna, was the importance of multi-generational coalitions and recognizing that we are all in this together. Although we might be impacted in different ways globally, we all do have these same intentions. And so one of the questions that we have here that I'd love to ask Larissa is a bit more focused on specifically when we're talking about education. In particular, how do we integrate climate change into university higher education curriculum? And how does climate change and mental health, how are they connected to different subjects, to learning in different areas? Larissa, I know we've talked a bit about the teacher survey that you're working on. It'd be wonderful if you could connect these different ideas together.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I know there were a lot of questions from the audience about resources for people, educators at different levels. So in higher education, I really just wanted to get those resources into the hands of the audience, that there are some really interesting resources. One of the most extensive resources in this area is called the Existential Toolkit for Climate Justice Educators, which was created by some great experts and thought leaders in this area. I think that's a really great, it has a ton of resources for leading discussions about climate change and climate emotions, for curriculum and syllabi. And so I would definitely suggest looking at that if you're in higher education. There's also a great book that was written by Sarah Jaquette Ray called A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, which really, she's an educator that's been at the university level in environmental education for 15 years or so, and so really came to this work because she started to notice that in her teaching environmental education and teaching about all of the ills of what was going on in the world, that it was really having a significant toll on her students, and wanted to be able to be honest with them in a way that also wasn't traumatizing. So came to really, it's a really interesting discussion. It's geared towards Gen Z youth, but it really provides a very interesting discussion about why it's important to hold space for emotions and provide students with the tools. And so I think that's a great sort of introduction to this concept. And she was also involved in the Existential Toolkit resource that I mentioned. So that's for higher education. There's also some really great ones for younger that I just want to, maybe I can send them briefly after or something, or maybe afterwards, because I definitely want to make sure that everyone can kind of access the resources that are out there. I also put into the chat this sort of, it's a really rough, it's actually like an Excel sheet, but it has all of the resources that we've kind of found, and there's a whole category for educators of different resources that are out there. So I would suggest that everyone kind of looks at it if you're interested in resources in education for supporting climate emotions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Larissa. There are so many resources that we're sending in the chat that Larissa mentioned and that will definitely get out. I know, again, there are these networks that you can connect with to continue to be connected. And I know the NAAWE is going to continue to be focusing on this particular issue. I'm sure there will be future webinars. One question that I do have for Leslie actually is a lot of questions were asked about messaging. The idea that the sophistication of the fossil fuel industry's work in messaging against climate change by focusing on individual carbon footprint. These are efforts that make it harder for children to talk openly about their feelings. It makes, although people can relate to injustices people may be experiencing and feeling, it's hard to connect to that. And stories are often being suppressed, where students, even though are taking significant climate action, feel hopeless. So one of the biggest questions here is, A, can young people actually grasp the gravity of the situation that we're facing? And B, how do we balance positivity with the dire realities of the environmental degradation and concerns of climate change that we face? So about 5 people actually asked questions related to this. Leslie, when we're thinking about messaging, what's the best way we go about inciting hope through our messaging?
such a big question and an important one. Well, first of all, you know, kids, if they're not exposed to the climate education facts about what's happening in our world, they get it one way or another, right? You know, when I was interviewing a lot of 10 through 12-year-olds in the process of writing that book for middle school age kids, and often the parents would be sitting off to the side, and the parents were stunned how much the kids knew about climate change, in a way more than they did. And they're like, well, where are you hearing this? Are you hearing it at school? And they're like, no, we're just looking it up online. So, you know, just the notion of, you know, let's parse it out in little pieces probably is not very realistic, but to be ready to respond to the questions they have, to be in it with them, to provide good resources, and of course, everything we've been talking about, make room for the feelings that arise with all of this is so essential. And honestly, processing the feelings is one of the ways of having hope. And real quickly, what I'll say is that some of the doomism that we're seeing, especially among young adults, is often not coming out of this kind of reasoned place of having reviewed all the literature and then come to some kind of conclusion. Sometimes it's just a way of dealing with the overwhelm. It's too big, it's too much, it's too complicated. So I'm just going to land on this false, solid ground of it's too late. So honestly, the ability to be with processing the emotions is one of the ways we can gain a strength in being in this shifting unknown where many things are possible. And we don't really exactly know how, when, or what things are going to look like. So that's just a really important piece. The other thing I'll just add real quickly is just to remember that there's more and more people coming to this. You know, there's this growing momentum, which is very helpful, and that it's sometimes hard to know the extent of our effectiveness. We might just say something to someone, which might seem insignificant, but that seed might take root, and who knows where that person's going with it. So there's this invisible aspect as well, where our impact may very well be larger than it might feel like. I don't think I got to all aspects of that question, but I hope that helped.
No, again, Leslie, that was 5 questions wrapped in one where you had 2 minutes to answer. I think we could all write another book about that another day. I really do think that what you touched on there, the ripples of our impacts, of our actions are greater than what we can expect. And one of the questions in the chat was about engaging youth in multi-generational or cross-cultural projects around climate. That was a question from a fellow Canadian, so I'm obviously going to answer that. You know, I really do think that when we're connecting with one another, and my nonprofit, Break the Divide, we're involved in the work of getting youth from different communities around the world on video calls with each other. So you might have a young person in San Francisco talking to a young person in the Canadian Arctic, learning about the local impacts of climate change. And one of the things that we do to prevent that doomism is really helping people see other pathways for resilience. How are communities that are not similar to you actually engaging in processes of building resilience at individual and collective levels? And I think, again, the world is so big. And although young people are learning about climate change, as Larissa talked about, you know, the ways that we're doing so are not oftenly grounded in trauma-informed approaches. And so while young people will continue to learn about climate change from their own means, we can create programming to connect them with stories that are hopeful, and we can do so in a way that promotes emotional resilience. The last question that I'll end off with for this panel, and I appreciate everyone staying for so past the hour. The last question is for Andra. Andra, when we think of the future developments in areas of work in this field, I know you've talked about the potential of developing programs for counselors, for teachers related to trauma and anxiety related to the climate crisis. It would be wonderful if you could just end this panel with a bit about where you are excited about areas of work in this field.
Oh gosh. Well, I think what I'm most excited about really is we're taking this whole systems approach. And so what I'm most excited about is 5 years after launching this initiative in our county, we're really starting to see things come together. And so what I'm most excited about is that to see it come true. So like this idea that like if you put in all these efforts and you're really working across this whole system and you're hitting all these different leverage points, you can start to see a shift happen. And then now I'm really excited to highlight, like, so much of it was us, I feel like, when we first started this initiative. And now I'm so excited that I'm able to highlight all these change makers and stories of hope and possibility in our county that weren't really there 5 years ago. And so I think like what I'm most excited about is that like this investment that we made in our county is something that could be replicated everywhere, right? And so it just needs an investment, and it needs an infrastructure, and it needs a system, but we can do this across the state of California. We can do this across other states. We can do this across the world, right? It's just a matter of putting those things in place. And so I'm excited now to be sharing this story. And I'm also excited to continue the work on the ground and really do this work with folks. But I really think I'm very excited to see that change is possible. I know that sounds so ridiculous, but I'm just so happy that it's possible and that it's working and that we're able to really share those stories.
Yeah, and hope can be radical, hope can be ridiculous, but it's up to all of us to hope, to continue to connect. We've gone through so many topics through this webinar. It's been so much fun listening to everyone, and I'm so glad that we had the chance to talk about emotional resilience, climate education, climate emotions, and all these very important topics. While we must continue to address the urgency of the situation and teach young people about the urgency of the climate crisis and taking action, we need to do so in a way that inspires action, inspires hope, and inspires connectedness. I'm really glad to have had the chance to moderate this panel today. Thank you to everyone. And I'm going to pass this back to Anne to finish off the session with some final announcements and talk about next steps.
Thank you so much, Abe, and to all of our panelists. I love how you're ending this panel, Abe, by saying hope can be ridiculous. It's just so wonderful to hear all of your stories, all of the great work. Thanks again to Andra and Larissa, Leslie, McKenna, Abe, and Emily and Sarah doing so much work behind the scenes. Just wanted to remind all of you that we will be sharing the entire recording, the slides, the chat notes with all of you sent directly to your emails, the same email address you used to register for today's webinar, and we'll also be posting it on our eePro website. I think there were hundreds of people asking and clamoring for the recording. I know I'm excited to check out the recording too. And if you liked today's webinar, I just want to invite all of you to check out our entire webinar series that's available on our website. You can see webinars going back to 2015, and you can peruse all of the recordings, the notes, and the slides there too. And we're going to end with just a couple of announcements for events that are coming up, conferences that are coming up for us at NAAEE. The first one is the Natural Start Conference. Registration is now open, and they'll be meeting in person in Cincinnati, Ohio, and there are also online options available. This is for early childhood educators, and if you want to learn more, check out the website Conference at Natural Start. Additionally, we've got our NAAEE, our main conference. We're going to be meeting in person for the first time in 2 years. We are accepting proposals right now for the research symposium and the regular conference, and we are looking for your best and brightest ideas. Conference proposals are due April 29th, and we'll also be having virtual as well as in-person options for folks. Okay. And that is it. Thanks again. Thanks to all of you for staying late with your great questions. Thank you to our panelists. And I think before we close, we should already confirm a part 2. There's so much excitement, so much chatter, and so much love in the chat for all of you. So thanks again for all the work that you do. Thanks for spending the last hour and 20 minutes with us. And we'll see you on another webinar very soon. So take care, everybody. And thanks again. And our panelists are still smiling. Thanks all. Take care, and we'll see you soon.
Great job.
Thanks for having us. That was fun.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
And
Thank
thanks, Judy.
Bye.
Hope you can catch your plane. All righty. Bye, y'all.